Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. This week, we'll take a look at what's happening in Israel and how that is affecting both relations within the country, between it and the Palestinians, and in the region writ large. Then we shift over to India, a rising power in South Asia that has just concluded a major technology agreement with the United States. And finally, let's look at Brexit, 3 years after it all started and what it is doing to the United Kingdom. Here to talk about all of these issues are Deborah Amos, international correspondent for National Public Radio. Deb, great to see you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Also with us, Bobby Ghosh, editor of Bloomberg Opinion. Bobby, great to have you back.
Good to be back.
And Philip Stevens, contributing editor of the Financial Times. Philip, great to see you.
Great to see you. Thank you.
Let's start with some breaking news. The decision by Secretary of State Antony Blinken not to go to Beijing this week, a much anticipated visit. He was going there, would be meeting with Xi Jinping, the first Secretary of State to go to China in 4 years, the first one to meet with Xi Jinping in 6 years. A general sense that the relationship was thawing, but just this week, we found out that a balloon may have been at the wrong place at the wrong time. It was loitering over Montana, a place where there are 150 intercontinental ballistic missile silos. The balloon was Chinese. The Chinese have now said, yes, it was ours, but it really was a civilian research balloon that somehow went off course, even though it was loitering or lingering over Montana for quite some time. A lot of uncertainty. The Pentagon called together senior defense officials, and the White House was talking about possibly thinking about military options. So a crisis in the making or just a fluke? Let me, Bobby, turn to you. And what do you make of this, both of this, the fact that the Chinese may be spying on the United States? I'm shocked to hear that. But also the fact that the Secretary of State has decided that in response, at least for now, is going to postpone a long-anticipated visit to China.
And that is the biggest surprise, to be perfectly honest. The balloon itself feels very sort of 1950s, 1960s. I will allow that balloons now there are far more sophisticated intelligence gathering equipment that can be put on balloons than used to be the case during the Cold War. But we shouldn't be surprised that the Chinese are trying to spy on us. They're doing it all the time in 1,000 different ways. In some ways, far more efficient, much more effective than a balloon. I mean, just to think of cyber snooping as one example. If Chinese spying was something that the Biden administration found so objectionable that it would cancel a trip like this, there were 100 different excuses it could have come up with. It just seems, unless there's something on that we're not being told about the balloon, unless there's something we're not doing, that's an important caveat. Unless that is the case, it seems like the Biden administration was looking for an excuse to call off the trip, and that may have more to do with domestic politics than it does to espionage or geopolitics.
Deb, domestic politics, is that how you see it? Or at least, let's the caveat, and I think Bobby's caveat is good. We don't know everything, and we shouldn't assume that we know everything. But given what we do know, how would you interpret the decision, which really is surprising, as Bobby said, for Blinken to decide not to go?
Journalists always try to make up a narrative to fit the facts as we know them. So there's lots of surprises in this one. Domestic is as good an answer as any at the moment. I think if the Chinese had been faster, they were unusually fast for China to say, yep, it was us. Had they been a little bit faster, perhaps we wouldn't have had this outcome, because the gap in there's a balloon in the over the West Coast, and their admission allowed for a tsunami of backlash. Why didn't the Biden administration shoot it down? And so as that tsunami built, then you saw the pieces fall into place. So in some ways, the story is a timing story.
Timing story. I think Deb's right. Philip, took him 36 hours or so to admit it, but which is extraordinarily fast for the Chinese, but happens to be 36 hours too late if you want to influence the politics. But do you read it as a political issue, or you think there's something else there? And how do you think the Europeans will react to Blinken not going, given that they were hoping for certainly a thaw in U.S.-Chinese relations, so they could continue to do what they've been doing for a long time, which is to sell stuff?
Yeah, I think, look, there's no surprise in Britain or anywhere else in Europe that the Chinese are doing this stuff. At GCHQ, which is the sort of the British equivalent of the NSA, which tracks cyber attacks, there's a big map of the world in the entrance, near the entrance, which lights up when there are cyber attacks from different geographies. And the one from China on the map is permanently lit up like a Christmas tree. So we're under attack. So no surprises. I think there was a hope that the US, which had initially seemed to be, trying to play this down and not make an issue of it. I think there was a hope that everything could go ahead and that it was a squall rather than a storm in the relationship, and it may turn out still to be a squall. But I think the Europeans will be disappointed because they wanted Blinken to go, not least to get his view as well on whether this thaw that we've seen from the China side is real or not. Now, we all countries spy on each other, and we're only shocked, as you said, when one or other gets caught. So, I wouldn't be surprised if the West has its own balloons floating up there sometimes. So I think this is really unfortunate.
And the other thing is with the timing, Ivo, is that the Chinese have given an explanation and then the trip was called off. So it's not just that the signal is not just that you sent a balloon, but it is, we don't believe your story.
Yeah, and it shows the fraughtness of the relationship. And before we went on the air, we were talking about this as sort of all the scariness of what Cold War confrontations are about. There is a level of distrust that means that whatever is said publicly is discounted, and the worst fears are taken as real. It, reminded me not just of the Hainan incident. Remember when George W. Bush had just become president, and a U.S. spy plane was intercepted and had to land in China, but also during the Cuba Missile Crisis, a Soviet spy plane that happened to cross into U.S. airspace, and people thought that might be part of a deliberate attack, and it was wrong place, wrong time kind of thing. This is what happens when the relationship is fraught, and probably why you want to have the kind of dialogue that Blinken was about to have in Beijing. But we will be watching the story because there may be more new narratives, new facts will lead to new narratives. And with that, Deb, let me turn to you to our top story here is really the developments in Israel. Massive protests in the streets, escalating violence both within Israel and on the West Bank between Palestinians and Israeli forces. Blinken was actually in both the West Bank and Jerusalem this past week in order to try to settle things down. But things are not settling down, both politically and unfortunately in terms of violence, and it seems to have pretty big implications for what's happening inside the country itself, for the relationship with the Palestinians and the relationship with the region at large. You know this region really well. Bring us sort of up to date about what we have seen in the last few days and what you think it all means.
Well, let's start with this turmoil over this new hard right governing coalition. And that conflict is over this proposal to reshape the role of the judiciary. What the justice minister wants is for the Knesset the Israeli parliament to overturn Supreme Court rulings. I mean, imagine how that would work in the United States. It wouldn't go over well. Today, or this morning, I guess, Israel's Attorney General published a legal opinion that the move would change the structure of the regime. And that is probably an opinion that would be shared by Washington and by Paris, and they've made that very clear. So Netanyahu's allies puts him on the spot with his international friends. Then, of course, we had the violence between Israel and Palestine. A couple of weeks ago, I went to a off-the-record, shall-not-be-named conference in New York, and there were a lot of Israeli think tankers there, and they said that the Intifada has already started. It just looks different than the last ones. It's a rolling piece of violence. It's about nihilist young Palestinians who have no allegiance to the Palestinian Authority nor to Hamas. They don't even know them. They're too far away. And it is the toughest challenge they've ever had because these young people believe that the only way to break through this incredible impasse in their lives is to raise the stakes. And that is clearly what they are doing. And it's very hard for Biden to come away with anything from that trip. He got a little bit of movement on relations with Arab states and Israel, but he didn't get much over quelling the violence. And he got nothing, as far as I could tell, on this notion that Parliament can overrule the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's a really tough set of issues, and it is, Bobby. It's having a major implication for the region. Remember that when the Abraham Accords were first concluded, the UAE had to get a promise from Netanyahu that he would not annex the West Bank, and yet now he has in his government, Netanyahu and his new government, people who, in fact, want nothing but annexing the West Bank and dealing with Palestinians as if they really shouldn't be living there. Tough question for the Arabs in the Gulf states and others. How do you think they're reacting to this? And do you see them moving back from where they are when it comes to the Abraham Accords, or is this an issue? They say that's for the Palestinians to figure out, and we're just moving on.
Well, it is a very awkward situation for them. In the past, when there were spasms of violence between Israel and the Palestinians, they could be on the sidelines wringing their hands and wagging a disapproving finger in the general direction of Israel and appeasing the opinion on the among their own Arab citizens. Now, the signatories of the Abraham Accords, particularly the UAE, which led the charge in that direction, have ownership of some of Netanyahu's actions, or the actions that are taking place under his rule. And I think they knew going in that there would be occasions when there would be uproar in the Arab street about Palestinians being killed by Israelis for whatever reason. They also knew that there would be occasions when Israel conducted operations against Iran that could rebound on them, that could make it awkward for them and their efforts to communicate with the Islamic Republic. But for both these things to happen at the same time, that's a perfect storm. That's something I think, judging by how flat-footed they were, I don't think they anticipated both of these things happening at the same time. And to have, while this is going on, an administration in the US that at least rhetorically keeps saying that, we want to pivot away from the Middle East. We don't want to get involved too much in the Middle East. So this is a very uncomfortable and an awkward moment for all the signatories of the Abraham Accords. It's also a moment in which those who didn't sign the Accords, primarily Saudi Arabia, to say, we told you so, their decision not to sign until there was a two-state solution is looking pretty good. And so it's a really awkward position for the rulers of the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, but primarily the UAE. It's a really, really uncomfortable situation. They have no leverage. Their whole argument going into this in the Abraham Accords is, we'll now have better leverage over the Israelis. It'll allow us to protect Palestinian interests. Not true.
For an administration that said it didn't want to have much, wanted to pivot, boy, have they sent a lot of high-level
that is true.
signatories to to Tel Aviv early in the Israeli government's administration, and now there'll be reciprocal trips back. It's not that it doesn't seem to me that there is much of a pushback yet to this government. Now, they haven't done anything that's irreversible. They haven't set up new settlements. They haven't, set this law that you can overturn Supreme Court rulings. So there's nothing quite yet, but it's just a lot of high-level meetings.
Yeah, I think there's a concern in Washington about the government, and they're trying to figure out how to mitigate the worst possibilities. And Philip, just to you, I mean, the relationship between the United States and Israel has its own dimensions and peculiarities, but the relationship between European countries and Israel is also important, and everything that's happening over the past, what we just see in the past few weeks, really is straining that credibility as well. The sense of the democracy in Israel may be under threat, that rising violence between Palestinians and Israelis is happening at a time when every government, including the U.S., but every government in Europe still believes in a two-state solution, when I think, as Deb says, whoever believes in a two-state solution, it's not the youth on the West Bank. They believe in a one-state solution and a Palestinian state solution, and will use violence because they frankly don't have anything else they can do. How does Europe look at this, and how worried are they?
Well, I think the European view is best described by two words. The first is despair, and the second is powerlessness. The despair comes from, as Deb says, the signs that this present government is taking Israel away from liberal democracy towards the illiberal democracy we see now in places like Hungary and in Turkey, where basically the rule of law as upheld by the judiciary comes under attack. So that's a real concern, I think, for all European governments. The second concern is, of course, the as you say, the simmering violence between the Palestinians and the Israelis, the threat that the Netanyahu government will move towards annexation, although a lot of people talk about de facto annexation, or even if not de jure yet. But also there's a sort of powerlessness. The Europeans have traditionally, if you like, bankrolled the Palestinians in the sense that paid for a lot of the money to keep the West Bank going. But there is a recognition and a sense that the Palestinian authorities are sort of empty husk now. It doesn't have the young people, even on the West Bank. It doesn't have a strong leader, a coherent political structure. Even if you set aside the rivalry with Hamas, so there's no Palestinian authority that Europeans can sort of get behind and trust, as it were, to present to Israel a more sort of realistic, if you like, and doable, pragmatic answer to some of these problems. So I think the Netanyahu government has very few friends in Europe, but as I say, the Palestinians aren't seen as helping themselves. At least when I talk about Palestine, I mean the Palestinian Authority isn't really helping itself.
I think despair and powerlessness may be a good description, not just for the Europeans, but frankly for the Palestinians, for the Gulf Arabs, for the United States, and perhaps even for Benjamin Netanyahu. Despair that he is stuck in a coalition that he can't get out because otherwise he might end up in jail, and powerless to do anything about it. Because the right seems to control it. So one way to think about it is we're living in an age of despair and powerlessness, which is usually not a good thing if you care about peace and stability that we're seeing. Deb, last word to you.
So let's also think about this. Mahmoud Abbas hasn't had an election in more than a decade. Anybody under 35 in the Palestinian community has never voted. If the Palestinian Authority somehow collapses, it's not too far-fetched. He dies, he becomes incapacitated. Then that fig leaf of, of course we could have a two-state solution. There's Israel here, there's the Palestinian Authority there, disappears. So there are people who are gaming out, what do we do if the Palestinian Authority collapses? And I don't think anybody has a good answer on that. And let me just inject a tiny note of optimism. Despite all of this, Azerbaijan, for the first time, sent an ambassador to Israel, and Chad is establishing an embassy. So the problem always with this is, you can find those kind of things in this conflict. And then the big issues that you think, good God, how do they get out of this?
Yeah, no, it's a conflict that keeps on giving, unfortunately, in many different ways. Let's Bobby, switch over to India. Soon to be the most populous country in the world, already the most populous democracy, with asterisks, but that's true for most democracies these days. And a country that is really trying to figure out where it wants to go. It has a large neighbor in China where there are significant tensions, including armed or at least clubbing tensions on the disputed border. This major agreement just signed between the United States and India on technology and emerging technology cooperation and defense cooperation. Strong relationship between Russia and India when it comes to defense industries and defense capabilities, and of course oil. And a leader who is as ambitious as any. And so the country better than anyone. Where do you think we are today? What is it that India is trying to accomplish? How many horses are they riding at the same time, to mix metaphors? And where do you think this is going?
Well, let's start with that agreement, the new agreement for a technological partnership between India and the US. I think that is not what the paper it's written on. There is a lot of fantasizing that takes place in Washington, in American foreign policy circles about India. And it stems from notions that, well, India is a democracy. Indians come to America a lot. They're very successful here. They speak English. Quite a lot of them in any case. And we have a common enemy, which is China. And surely all this adds up to the logic of a good, strong relationship with India. And on paper, yes, it does. But in reality, not so much. There was a poll out 3 or 4 weeks ago, which showed that for all the steadily improving ties between India and the United States over the last 20 years, Indians, which is, if you look past the Modi government, if you look at ordinary Indians, still harbor deep suspicions about the United States and its intentions. That poll said that after China, India views the United States as posing the greatest threat to India of all the countries in the world, even a greater threat than Pakistan. Let that sink in for a second, that Indians think that the United States is a greater threat than Pakistan. There's also that same poll showed that Indians blame the United States and NATO much more than they blame Russia for the war in Ukraine. The United States has improved relations with the Indian government, but it has led relations with Indians as a whole, the most populous nation on the planet by some reckoning now. It's let that relationship sort of slide. It's assumed that relationship will take care of itself. That's clearly not happening. So Indians, and we're seeing it in India's attitude towards Ukraine, both at the government level and at the individual Indian population level, tend to be more pro-Russian and more suspicious of the US. And then to come to this technology agreement. Indians have a very large IT sector. They provide a lot of IT services. They're not really very good at producing cutting-edge technology. That's just never been India's strength. India does not produce a single world-class video game, never mind a single digital product that you and I or anybody else can use every day. India's ability to produce arms is very, very poor. Brazil is better at this. China, obviously, much better. Even South Africa produces more world-class weaponry than India does. And Turkey is another country where the weapons industry has developed far faster than India has. India has a very poor track record in manufacturing. Quality is very, very bad. The delivery record is appallingly bad. It's not an accident that American companies, European companies around the world have been depending on China for all these years. India also has cheap labor. India is just not very good at making things. And there's a reason why India depends on imports overwhelmingly from China for a huge range of things that Indians seem unable to produce themselves. So color me skeptical. I think that the logic that points to a stronger U.S.-Indian relationship is, the logic, I don't question the logic, but I think it ignores a lot of ground reality, political reality, cultural reality, historical realities that come in the way.
Philip, historical realities is something that when it comes to India, Brits know very well. How do you see that sort of this, I guess, the fundamental tension between the structural reality, which suggests closer cooperation, and the real on the ground reality, which makes it difficult to think that's going to happen anytime soon?
Well, I think people in Britain, but also in the US and elsewhere, make a fundamental mistake about India. And we tend to say, look, these people have got to decide which side of the fence they're on. Are they on the Western US-led side, or are they with Russia and China? The Indians have decided they're on both sides of the fence. So India is an active member of the Quad, the Asia Quad, which is really designed to, with Japan, Australia, and the US to counter the buildup of Chinese power. And India wants to see the Quad develop and expand, and actually to bring in others, not so much on the military side, but in terms of trade arrangements as a counter to China. But India doesn't see a contradiction as far as I can see. The Indian ministers and officials I've talked to don't see a contradiction without saying, but that doesn't mean we are in a permanent alliance with the West. We are not going to give up our long-standing relationship with Russia, which is 60 years old, and there's a dependence there on, as we heard, they're not very good at making their own weapons, although they're now buying American weapons. They still buy a lot of their military equipment from Russia, so they're not going to give it up. We are not going to take a, quote, Western view on Ukraine. I think it was the Indian foreign minister who said not very long ago that the problem with the West is it thinks that when it's got problems, they're the world's problems. But when the world has problems, the West doesn't think that they're problems. So, you get this perspective. It's very much, this is a Western, war with Russia, and the West may have, has some responsibility as well. But I think this is the world that we're moving into, a world where you don't see, it's not sort of segmented into fixed alliances. It's a world in which countries will have allegiances on certain issues and with certain players, but will also shift. So India's not aligned. It's on both sides. It's aligned with the West in terms of standing up to China and protecting itself. But it wants to keep buying oil, as it's been doing from Russia. And it's not going to be told by the West that it can't buy oil. And I think in a way, I think the US administration is beginning to accept that in a way. It's not been that critical of India in India's equivocal stance since the Ukraine war. And I think that's the world that we now live in. And India won't be the only country, isn't the only country. Turkey's another one that will play that sort of game.
Deb, that's sensible, but I'm not sure that that's in the corridors of power in Washington still how the world is seen, which is increasingly seen as divided between good guys and bad guys, which is the only way I think Americans look at the world. By the way, by instinct, by nature, given where the U.S. comes from, and you can't be on both sides of the fence in some way, and then at the same time as you're trying to wean India to our side and off the other side, we still don't have an ambassador. We haven't had an ambassador in India since the 20th of January, 2021, when Trump's very good, believe it or not, appointment, Ken Juster, left to go back to Washington.
I was reading Bobby's journalism before today. I don't know a whole lot about India. I follow it just like a civilian. And I noted that the Indians blame America and NATO for the war in Ukraine more than Russia. I know that there are plans afoot to have a vote in the General Assembly for an international war crimes tribunal for Ukraine. And that will be a moment where you can't play both sides. You're either a yes or a no, or even an abstention is a political position. I don't think we're close to that vote yet. There's lots of politicking that would have to happen before it happened in the General Assembly. But what do you think India would do at that moment? How would they square we're on both sides?
I think they would abstain, and I think from their perspective, they could reasonably abstain. If you look at what they've said at the UN carefully, they've been critical of Russia in terms of the infringements in sovereignty, while not being supportive of sanctions. So they haven't been wholeheartedly on Russia's side in this. So, there have been some criticism. So, but I take your point, Ivo, that, the US hasn't accepted this new world yet, and perhaps won't accept it. But I think it's going to be the reality. These countries now, these large, very large in India's case, and calling it a middle power is perhaps incorrect, but these near great powers are not going to be told by one side or the other that on every issue they have to stand with the West. And
I think it's worth you flicked at the Ivo that for all the talk of a stronger relationship with India, if you look at actual actions from the American side, you have to ask, is this really an important relationship to the Biden administration? As you say, there has not been an ambassador for 2 years now, and this is not one where you can blame the Republicans. The administration's candidate, Eric Garcetti, former mayor of Los Angeles, no India experience whatsoever, or any particular expertise. His candidature was being opposed by Democrats, and yet the Biden administration keeps persisting with him for reasons that completely baffle me. In the meanwhile, in that 2-year period, there have been 5 chargés d'affaires at the embassy. 5 different people have been in charge. If this is supposed to be our idea of an important relationship, we're not showing it.
Well, this is there's a whole new question about how the U.S. Has diplomatic representation. Eric Garcetti was the co-chair of the Biden election campaign. That I think tells you everything you need to know about why the Biden administration is sticking with him, or at least the White House is. I'm not sure whether the State Department sees it the same way, but that's how, unfortunately. Or fortunately, how politics works in the U.S. But the point, I think, stands. It makes it hard to make the case that this relationship is as critical and as important that one can have. Let's finally move on, Philip, to Brexit. This was the uncelebrated, unremarked upon 3rd anniversary of Brexit in this week. Instead, I think more people were out in the streets in strikes than probably since 1979, or at least that's when I was a young student in England. That's what I remember of that period in 78, 79. Bring us up to date about where we are. It seems to be just to be nice, it seems to be a mess.
I think it's more than a mess, sad to say, because I don't like talking in such terms about my own country. But as you say, 3rd anniversary. In fact, 3 years today, February the 3rd, 1990, Boris Johnson, then the Prime Minister, went to our Naval College in Greenwich on the banks of the River Thames in London to give a big speech marking the official beginning of Brexit, as he would put it, unshackling ourselves from Europe. And he declared the beginnings of a second Elizabethan age. In this great speech, he talked in his normal sort of rather vaulting rhetoric about Britain going out and, every corner of the world and reconquering new markets, signing trade deals with the US and India and everyone else, and being a beacon again for freedom in the world, as we were supposed to be in the 16th century, although some might query that. But instead, this week, what did we have? We had the IMF at the beginning of the week saying that Britain this year our economy will be worse than every major economy in the world, including Russia's. So our performance will be worse than Russia's. Towards the end of the week yesterday, on Thursday, the Bank of England came out and said it's going to take us till 2026 to get back to the level of output that we had pre-COVID in 2019. So we've got economic stagnation. We've got, as you said, public sector workers from health, the fire service, transport, who've all had their wages held down for several years now, finally break out in the streets. We've had, for the first time ever, nurses going on strike in the National Health Service. We've got paramedics. And we've got a government which is sort of caught, I think, in the headlights, because internationally, our standing has rarely been lower, because Brexit's been followed not by a sort of friendly relationship with our European neighbours. It's been followed by an almost continuous row as the government's tried to renegotiate, some would say renege on the agreement we had for Northern Ireland in trading arrangements, which are very special because of the peace agreement there between North and South, the Good Friday Agreement. We've had Joe Biden's administration saying, well, look, unless you sort out your relationship with Europe, don't expect to turn up at the White House and get, with great fanfare as Monsieur Macron, for example, of France has got. So we've done, I think, well in the sense of being out front on Ukraine. So I think the government gets some credit for that. But basically, the still relatively new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has now got a foreign policy which is about trying to repair relations. Now, bright spots, well, not many, but he is trying. The Prime Minister, unlike Boris Johnson, and we won't mention Liz Truss because she was just not there for long enough. Well, she did a lot of damage, but Sunak is a decent, honest man, if not the most imposing politician. He's trying to repair relationships, put quite a lot of work in with Emmanuel Macron in trying to repair the Anglo-French relationship, and he is trying to get an arrangement with the Europeans which will remove this running sore over Northern Ireland and protect the Good Friday Agreement. If he does that, it's still a very big if. In the next month or two, everyone's expecting Joe Biden to be both in Britain and in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland come Easter to mark the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. So it is possible that on the diplomatic front, at least, things will look better, but it's still a big if. There is a big gap between not so much Sunak, but the Tory party and Brussels about the shape of a deal on Northern Ireland. As far as the economy goes, and that in the end shapes how well a government does in the world, how much weight it carries in the world. Everything looks really, really quite depressing for the next several years. Everyone here now expects a Labour government in the election to win the election in 2024.
Deb, I know Philip mentioning Biden's potential visit for the Good Friday Agreement 25th anniversary in April, and also I think importantly, sort of using that potential visit as a leverage to try to get this government to finally find a way out of the mess that they created when Brexit happened with regard to Northern Ireland and the European Union and Ireland, and the negotiations seem to be going better between the UK and the EU. At least the sentiment is more positive. Do you see Biden using his quite considerable leverage in a way that might move things in the right direction, or
it's an issue that fires him up, and that seems to make a difference in how he wields that power. So we will see. I was really focused on that piece of data that says the British economy is doing worse than the Russians. I mean, it raises questions about maybe the sanctions policy toward Russia was the wrong way to do it. Maybe the idea was to get them to join, the UK, the EU, and then have them move back out. But I also wonder, who gets into the EU quicker? Is it Ukraine, or is it, Britain coming back? And I read all this and I wonder, is there a moment when Britain actually does think about coming back into the EU? And Philip, do you think that comes sooner or later?
Can I add to that question?
Yeah, please.
Because Philip, I've been reading a number of polls recently which suggest that, thanks to the economic situation, among other things, there is a strong buyer's remorse, even among Brexiteers. And I'm not talking about the politicians, but people who at the time voted for Brexit. There seems to be a strong buyer's remorse. A lot of polling that shows people think it has not gone as they were promised or they thought it would go. I'm skeptical that Britain can come back to the EU, certainly anytime soon. But might that sentiment empower Prime Minister Sunak in some way in his negotiations with the Europeans to sort of make more concessions and get what he needs from the Europeans?
I think you're both absolutely right in terms of all the polls now suggest that a sizable majority think that Brexit was a mistake. Well, it's not quite so clear that translates into, if we had the vote today, we'd vote to go back in, because people can admit they made a mistake, but say, well, yeah, but I'm not sure we want to reverse it with all the upheaval. I think the other crucial thing is that the EU doesn't want the UK back until it sees a stable consensus between the two political parties to stay in. What it doesn't want is to, for example, a Labour government to come in and say, yeah, we want to rejoin, and then negotiate us rejoining, and then another Conservative government coming in and saying, oh, we're going to leave again. So I think, we're talking about, I think my own view is we will be back into a very close relationship with the EU within, the next 5-10 years, but it's going to take time. The immediate problem for Sunak is that he's got about, 50 of his own MPs who are what I would call, Brexit fundamentalists. They think anything and everything to do with the EU is dangerous and intrusion on our sovereignty. And the big question in this negotiation now with Brussels over the Northern Ireland protocol, as it's called, is whether Sunak is prepared to face down those of his own MPs and the big unionist party in Northern Ireland. Now, if he does, he'll get the support of the Labour Party, so he'll have a majority. But is he brave enough to say, yep, I'm ready to see, perhaps 30, 40 of my own MPs go in and vote against me in Parliament? I hope he is, because I think that could be the beginning of the sort of rebuilding of the relationship that you mentioned, Bobby.
Bobby, I mean, you've spent a lot of time in London. You know how the politics goes there. And what's your sense that I guess the big question, if Philip is right, that sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, a new consensus emerges for a closer relationship, not not rejoining, but a closer relationship, perhaps as joining the single market or some Norwegian or a Swiss version of the relationship between the UK and the EU. Is that more likely to happen with under a Conservative government, and Sunak seems to be the only one left, or is it something that Labour may run on and a next government would try to figure out how to do? How do you see it?
Well, the Labour leadership has not come out in any sort of full-throated support for the idea of getting back together. metaphorically speaking, with the EU in any reasonable fashion. The Labour leader, Keir Starmer, has been sort of cautious on that subject. His predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, even more so. They read the polls. They know, I think, that a lot of potential voters are having second thoughts. But to the point that Philip was making, you know, they don't seem to be confident that that is an issue on which they can win a big election landslide. And by the way, they don't even need to do that. All the polling suggests they'll win a massive landslide without really doing very much, because the Conservatives have set their own house aflame. So I don't see I don't see this being a major issue in the election campaign next year. And so I don't think that that Labour will move the needle a great deal. Mostly because politically they don't really need to. And they're, I think, still nervous about stirring up what could be a kind of, they're nervous about doing anything that would impede their what now seems to be a sure path back to power.
Yeah, no, that's it. That probably, so then when you have a campaign slogan is "We're not them."
Yeah,
and that gets you a vast majority. That's pretty darn good. So why bother doing anything to make that any worse? Philip, last word to you.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think Bobby's right. They're not making anything of it before the election, because why change the subject when everyone's talking about how terrible the government is? But I think, I'm an optimist here and a pro-European here. I think in power, Labour would do quite a lot, not to get us back in, but to really build a political, particularly on political foreign policy affairs, security affairs, as well as some of the trade issues, will get us a lot closer back in. Because, and also, you know, countries like France and Germany want us closer. You know, Britain, for all its troubles, is still, you know, one of the top 3 European economies, and with France, the one with, you know, despite all its troubles, with the strongest military. So, you know, I think there is a chance post the next election that Britain will restore some of its relationship with Europe, and in the process, let's hope, restore its economic well-being.
Well, if and when that happens, we will be there to analyze it and to see why and how it happened. Until then, lots of other news coming forward in the next few weeks. This week, this is it. We've done our diligence to go through all the big issues, including some of the breaking stories, and here to analyze all of it and to thank you are Bobby Ghosh, Deborah Amos, and Philip Stevens. Thanks so much for being part of this week's World Review. We'll be back next week with another edition. Until then, want to wish everyone a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you.